Hey everybody, it's Melissa again, and I'm sitting here at the True the Vote Summit here in Houston, Texas, and we just had a very interesting interaction on the floor of the True the Vote Summit. John Fund was speaking and invoked Alaska as an example, and unbeknownst to him, the man in question, Senate hopeful Joe Miller, was sitting there and rebutted, and now Joe Miller is sitting here with me, and we're here to talk about what happened in Alaska, if there was true voter fraud, and what's going to be done about it.
Well, I've got to preface my comments with, you do have to be careful about a perception of sour grapes, and there is no question that there's a political cost that goes along with any candidate that tries to actually reform the system after an apparent loss. Mm-hmm. And so, I want to first start out with those comments, but make it clear that what we're doing in Alaska is an intent to reform the system. We did see many, many problems. We have very little doubt that ballots for access prior to the vote, they were pre-filled out. We have very little doubt that there were a number of votes that were cast inappropriately. We had western districts in Alaska, for example, that in early absentee voting had a major margin of difference between what was actually cast on election day itself. When votes are cast 2 weeks ahead of time and you end up with a 30 or 40 point spread on election day, you got to scratch your head and ask, well, how did you have such a significant difference in the vote in such a short period of time? But that's not the only thing. We had affidavits that came out that showed that ballot boxes had ballots in the box even prior to the vote beginning. Those are things that have to be examined. We believe that part of the problem in Alaska stems from the fact that we have private entities that are in charge of ballot security.
What does that mean? Explain to people what the private entities.
The state of Alaska is contracted with private entities to provide for ballot security, both before and after the vote. The particular agency that conducted ballot security in our state has close alignment with a major native corporation that was actively engaged in the race, both in the primary and general, against us. And that concerned us. It should concern anybody that really wants to uphold the integrity of the vote. And my main concern in approaching this post-election is that we have significant numbers of people in Alaska that are very concerned about whether or not their vote will even count in the future. And we want to make sure, we want to assure them, look, that the vote does have integrity. We're going to do everything that we can to clean up the system so that they can go forward understanding that their vote is going to be counted. It's not going to be devalued. One of the strongest points that we alleged in the litigation in the post-election phase was that our votes were counted differently than my opponents. And we could demonstrate objectively, in fact, that our votes had less value than my opponents did, by virtue of the fact that our machine count votes were the only ones that were counted. We did not have an opportunity to actually have a hand count of our votes. On the other hand, my right-hand opponent got a hand count. Her hand count numbers actually were greater by hundreds of votes than our machine count. And so we argued, look, if you're going to give that advantage to one candidate where hundreds of more votes are going to appear as a result of a hand count, and you can speculate as to why. Maybe the machine undercounted, maybe there were stray marks on the ballot that then in the hand count actually got counted. You absolutely have to report that to the other candidate. Otherwise, the votes for that candidate have less value than the other. For us, that was a real clear point. So at the end of the day, we really never knew what our count was. There's an argument, in fact, John Fund made the statement, well, even with the allegations, he didn't think that, we could overcome the margin. But the fact of the matter is we never knew what that margin was because we never had a reliable count.
But 11,000, to that point, seems like even if they engaged in fraud, to be insurmountable in a state like Alaska, where the population is so small.
Well, when you look at the ultimate end of it, it was a question of about 2.5%. That's what would have swung the vote. Mm-hmm. And in our state, at 1%, you've got a state paid for authorized recount. But even in that recount, this is interesting, we asked that we would have a hand count. And when the State Department of Elections Division of Elections said that, look, it doesn't matter what you ask us for, it doesn't matter whether you're entitled under the statute to it or not, you will not get a hand count. You'll only get a machine count. And we tried to contrast that with the fact that, look, that's a different count than what you actually get with a hand count. Whether or not those numbers would be enough to close it, whether or not the fact that, we had thousands upon thousands of ballots, well over 5,000 people came in, did not show proper ID. That was proven. We had a review of many of the precincts post-election that reflected that. We knew that thousands of felons had voted. We knew that thousands of ballots had been pre-filled out prior to the vote, had been accessed, had been manipulated. And that's without even getting to the fact that the native corporations that were engaged in the race, as totals, spent probably more with their in-kind donations as well as their donations to the Alaska Standing Together than all of the political candidates combined in the general election. And it wasn't an ethics issue. Mr. Fund asserted that was ethics. It wasn't ethics, it was illegal. As a federal contractor, which is what these native corporations are, they take 8A contracts. That's why they're worth $8 billion. Well, I don't know what the total amount is, but billions of dollars. It's a result of the fact that they get these no-bid contracts that there's no competition for. There's guaranteed profit. It's grown them to this extraordinary size. They're supposed to be disadvantaged companies. That's why they have this advantage, and yet they take that money and then they invest it into a race. Clearly a violation of federal contractor laws, not to mention the fact that they also, in addition, receive billions of dollars of federal funding under a provision of ANSCA. Those regional corporations are prohibited from utilizing those funds for political use. It's clear that the fact that they donated the hundreds of thousands, probably millions of dollars to this race, that they're in violation of that provision as well. It's not just a matter of ethics, it's a matter of unlawful activity. And mind you, this is the second race where the regional corporations have flexed their muscle and demonstrated their ability to control an outcome. I'm no fan of Ted Stevens, but Ted Stevens was effectively defeated by these native regional corporations as well. That was an undercover race. I mean, they weren't out in the open with Alaskans standing together. They were working behind the scenes, but nonetheless putting their influence and money toward Senator Begich and his victory. This one, they had less time to organize. They didn't expect me to win the primary. Once they did, they knew that they had to be overt in their action, and they were. And in fact, it's our position that was illegal activity, and I believe the FEC is going to conclude the same. I mean, there are decisions out there about some tribes that have done committed similar acts in the lower 48 where the FEC has determined that in fact those were illegal acts. So it's not ethics, it's illegal. That's our position, and we think that that's going to be upheld.
So the only question I have, though, in a state like Alaska where the Murkowski family controls the state essentially, or did until Sarah Palin came in, and then it's been kind of divided and very divisive, how are you going to have any hope of more fairness if the government is controlling these, the ballots instead of a independent entity?
Well, the first step is to make sure that the regional corporations can't do this again. And that was, again, the most significant monetary influence of the race. I think it was really had more influence on the numbers that Murkowski got than anything else. And so they basically have to be neutered. They're either the FEC and or a court needs to come out and rule that that act is illegal. There an injunction issues against further activity of that nature, and that's a major step in the right direction. But I think there also has to be significant election reform in our state, including a mandated, exclusion of private entities from being engaged in ballot security. We use what's called the Diebold machine, the same machine that was banned in California, because it has a high degree of not just error, but also ability to be fraudulently manipulated. You don't ban a machine from a state the size of California unless there's good evidence that there's problems with it, but we continue to use it. I think that there has to be mandated by law the ability of a candidate, a losing candidate, no matter what the spread is, to be able to review his or her ballots and make a determination based upon a hand count of the actual number of votes received. There needs to be greater accountability with ballots. In the state of Alaska, surplus ballots are destroyed at the precinct level, and the only evidence that you have that they've been destroyed is the signature of somebody from that precinct. I mean, that's just absolutely atrocious. So, you've got literally thousands of ballots after the race that are floating around that can be used, in ways, obviously, to change the vote. We had multiple precincts that came into Juneau at the time that the write-in counts were counted, that came in sorted by U.S. Senate candidate, and yet you had well over a dozen different inquiries on the ballot by candidate and proposition. That only happens if there's manipulation of those ballots for purposes of influence of the U.S. Senate race. There's no other reason that an illegal act such as influence or manipulating those ballots, even the sorting itself is an unlawful act. But why was it done? I mean, there's a degree of speculation that goes along with it, but it certainly reflects that, again, things aren't right. Things need to be changed. We need to get better oversight and accountability in order to clean things up in Alaska. My main concern, and the reason why I'm still engaged, why I'm at this particular event, is to ensure that we have the tools necessary to restore integrity to the vote in Alaska. If I get engaged in a race in the future, I want to make sure that these stumbling blocks are removed. Certainly I've learned from a race that it's not just an issue. We aren't saying, oh, we lost because of voter fraud. We're saying that we saw voter fraud. It needs to be cleaned up. And really, I think that people, when they see it, need to be, it's such a big issue that it isn't something that somebody ought to say, well, this is going to hurt your political future, you shouldn't be doing this, or it's not enough to win the election or lose the election. But the point is, if you know it happened, then I think you have a responsibility to address it. And right now, with really the powers that be in Alaska, unless we harness the group that was behind us in our election change isn't going to happen. And it's going to be the same today or next year as it was today.
Okay, so that leads to my final question, which is, what are you going to be doing besides trying to clean up the election law and everything else going on in Alaska? What are you going to be doing career-wise here?
Well, I'm the chair of Western Representation PAC. That was publicized by PR last week. We're going to be actively involved in recruiting and backing constitutional conservative candidates throughout the United States. We want to be of significant influence in 2012. So that's a major effort that's underway. Speaking at a number of Tea Party events over the next month, I'll probably do events of that nature as much and as often as possible, not just on behalf of Western Representation PAC, but just to motivate what we broadly consider to be the Tea Party movement. The reason I got engaged in the senatorial race wasn't because of opportunity or because I dislike Murkowski. I mean, I think her votes are atrocious, continue to think that, but it's because of where we're at as a nation. I really believe we don't have much time to get things turned around. We've got this degree of statism now that if allowed to continue, we'll never be able to reverse course. And for me, it's so transparent that the Constitution expects something so entirely different than what we've got right now at the federal level. And that's why we're where we're at fiscally, is because we've grown government into this gargantuan entity that no reasonable reading the Constitution could authorize. And it's taken on powers that under the 10th Amendment the states ought to have. And I think there's a real movement afoot across the country to get those powers back. And I think that really is the only hope, is to reduce that growth, reduce the dependency that the federal government has created in order to get the country back on track. And we got time, I think, but not much. And I think everybody that's engaged ought to just redouble their efforts. And that really is what I'm doing at the national level, stateside, vote integrity, but also working on the state legislature. We won, in fact, 1/2 of the geographic area of the state by population too, almost. We have, 6 major geographic areas: the interior, the Kenai, Wasilla, Mat-Su-Borough. We won all of those. A number of the districts within those particular geographic areas we won, and yet not all those districts have friendly state legislators. So we're forming a state PAC. In fact, we have some fundraisers that are planned next week, and we're going to be influential in those state legislative races as well. In part, if, maybe to get a jump up on the initiative process. If we can get enough friendly legislators in place, we can get changes effectuated there. But also, in order to get control of spending in the state of Alaska. The state of Alaska, over the last 4 years, has seen almost every year double-digit increases, in part because of the public unions and their influence on our state. We're a union state. Public unions have essentially built into our state budget almost a guaranteed 6% increase per year. With the other spending, it's been double-digit almost each and every year for the last 4 years. We've got to get control of it, in part because in Alaska, about 40% of our economy is dependent on the federal dollar. We know that's going away. We're already saying, one of the things I preached during our campaign was, look, earmarks are gone. We need to look to the private enterprise. We need
Not
to
for
look to the
Lisa
resource
Murkowski.
base.
Well,
What's
they are
that?
for her, even for her right now.
They're all gone, at least, well. And I think that's a
Against her will.
Against her will, that's right. And it's kind of interesting. We're speculating as to how she's going to deliver to all of these entities that backed her. And it should be interesting to see how they react, because the earmark, even though it's a very small part of the budget, still had an impact. If she is successful in maintaining the AA corporate structure, that's going to be a big win for a constituent base in that corporate area. But we think that that's probably also going to be at least limited and maybe even removed. Can't continue to spend the way we are. That's one of the low-hanging fruit that I think Congress is probably going to go after. So should be interesting to see how things develop. But we aren't going away, as you saw earlier. Not everybody's excited about that, but we're going to continue to push hard as hard as we can.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
You
So
bet.
nice to meet you.
Good to meet you too.